Okay, I am ready to get started. So I am Sharon, and I'm going to be presenting today on my process for automating temporary database permissions.
Sharon, we can't hear you. Are you on mute by any chance?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I muted myself instead of unmuting myself. I'm sorry. So I am Sharon, and I am going to be talking about automating temporary permissions. And so a little bit about myself. I've taught writing, high school journalism, and English, and then college Comp 101, the dreaded research paper, for a very long time. But after going through a nasty divorce, I had been adjunct faculty. I needed a full-time permanent job with benefits. And so I was on Twitter in the middle of the night, 2 a.m. as you are, and I saw a tweet about a program called DataGrillen. And it was about learning to code and moving into tech. And I thought, I can do that. And so I did. So I went through, it's called Launch Code. So DataGrillen is now Women Plus in Launch Code. And Launch Code is a company, it's a not-for-profit that works with people without the traditional computer science background move into tech. So I started this program, and I learned SQL. I went through the SQL class for free, by the way. And I ended up getting a job at a company called NISA, which is an investment firm here in St. Louis, which is in the middle of the United States where I live. And it's an awesome job. And I wanted to give back to the community and have other people have their lives changed like mine. And I was asked to come back and TA teaching assistant for the class. And then I ended up being the lead mentor for the class. So I've done that for the past 5 years or so. And then I started speaking, and I'm now on the advisory board for the St. Louis user group, SQL user group. And I am passionate about database security. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today.
Sharon, sorry, on mute again.
Thank you. I'm not sure what's happening, why it keeps muting. Sorry about that. So my expectations for the presentation are that as I've been trying to learn more about database security, there's a lot of information that's very introductory on what permissions are, what a role is, etc. There's a lot of really deep, really good in the weeds information, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of information for in the middle. So that's where I am at, and that's where I want to help other people who are in that space. So basically for this presentation, I am assuming you have a basic understanding of permissions. Login would be server-wide instead of user, and then user is a database level permissions. A role, which is a grouping of permissions, normally like Reid, which is select on the whole database, or securables, which are specific objects like tables, views, stored procedures, even a schema, where you could give permissions on that specific object instead of database-wide. So those are my expectations. And I also wanted to say that if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will try to make sure to answer your questions, if not during the presentation, at the Q&A at the end. So the principle of least privilege is this saying that we hear a lot about in security, cybersecurity, etc. Security is a big thing right now. And basically all that means is that we want to provide people access to what they need when they need it. They don't need it longer. They don't need it everything, but we want people to be able to do their job. So that's access, what people need and when they need it. And so there's two aspects to that we're going to talk about. Securables. I'm really big on giving permissions to those specific objects, what they need, not the whole database. So that's one of the principles of least privilege that I'm really big on. And the other one is temporary, which makes sense. My presentation's on temporary permissions. Just because somebody needs something, they might need access to a stored procedure for, probably not, for like a table or a view and for troubleshooting an issue. Well, that doesn't mean that they need that access from then on. They just need it for that day or two when they are actively troubleshooting. So when I first started as a DBA, most of the permissions tasks that I got were for the whole database and for forever. But every so often, somebody would say they only needed this permission for a day, a week, or a month. And I would dutifully write it on a Post-it note and put it on my monitor. And to help me remember to take those permissions off later. So as you can imagine, this, was not the best system. It was somewhat effective, but it was not the best. Sometimes the Post-its would fall on the floor or on the desk. I would forget to go back and do it, etc. But that was the first version of my temporary permissions journey. So the second version of my journey was, instead of doing the Post-its on the monitor, I created a table. And then I would put the information about the permissions into that table. And I would have a stored procedure that sent me an email when the permissions were expiring to remind me that the permissions were expiring. And then I would forward the email to the requester. And if they needed an extension, I could, update my little table, or otherwise it would remind me to take the permissions off. So this was better than the Post-its. At least things weren't falling on the floor and creating a mess. However, it created a lot of extra work. So it had extra work in terms of, not only did I grant the permission, but then I had to type the information into the table. So that was duplicate work. I was taking those emails and I would then forward it to the person who had requested the temporary permissions. So that was extra work. And then I had to go back and remember and, use the emails to remind myself to go back and delete those permissions. So it's a lot of extra work. So as we were moving toward using more securables and more and more temporary permissions, with the workload increasing, I certainly didn't want the DBA team to have that extra layer of duplicate work. So I started working on version 3 of my process. And this is more of an automated process. It's still ongoing. So I'm, make tweaks to it on a regular. And I just wanted to also make a comment that this process was built for on-prem, and I have not tried using it in Azure, so it probably would need to be, I'm not sure how that would work, but this is an on-prem developed version. So with my demo, I'm going to go through 6 examples for you. So database level with role, database level with securables, server level permissions with roles, server level permissions with securables, and some error handling examples. Are there any questions that before we get into the demo?
I see none in the chat, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. So let's go ahead and look at, if we have a database, like I'm calling my database Post-it replacement because it's supposed to replace the Post-its on the monitor. And in my database, I'm just going to show you users. I have no users. And then in separate database, AdventureWorks. And again, I'll refresh to make sure it's accurate. There are no users. Because the demo is going to use SQL authenticated users, they're already in the logins. So you can see I have several of my demo logins are already here, but if you look at them, so if we pull that up, they don't actually have any permissions, either roles or securables beyond Connect. This one is Connect. Okay. So I have a table and called it temporary perms. So in the table, normally when I'm doing it in the real world, I use the SQL pane through editing. You can use whatever process you feel most comfortable that works best for inputting data. But this is how I would do it on the real world. So here I have my data. So server name, and I do that because we have a lot of servers. So that way it's easier to keep track of the information. The database name, you would put that in if it's going to be a database level permission. In this case, we are going to give Pam from the office. My manager's name is Pam, and we call her Pam from the office. So that's where that's from. So I put the username in here. Permission to grant or deny. You could do the deny if you use those. This time I'm going to give her read on the database, the whole database. So it is a role. So data reader. Then I have some switches here. Is it a securable? No. Is it a schema? No. And if it were a securable, I would put that information in here. I have requested by. In this case, it's me. I'm the one requesting it. So I have my own name and my personal email. So you could, whoever the ticket is, whoever if it's a developer or a business person, whatever that person is, you will put their email in there. And then an expiration date. And it includes time. So you could have it expire at a specific time of the day, not just during a day, which if it's really elevated, I like to use. Defaults to date added. And then I have a section in here for comments and this is where I would put the ticket number. So hopefully you have some kind of a change management system that comes through and that it's not just somebody stopping by your desk asking you for permissions. But if that's the case, you can also put that in there in the comments section. So whatever your change management system is, you can use that there. I would put in like a ticket number, or I could put in testing or something like that. I have a field in here for who added the information. This is helpful if you have a DBA team of more than one person, so that if somebody needs to go back and have questions or something, you can go back and see who put it in. Then here at the end, I have some switches. Is active, is applied. I default to true. If I put something in, it's active. But here I have not run anything to apply. You saw that Pam from the office did not have Reid yet because it's in my table, but it has not been applied yet. And then I have is server level permission and is a SQL authenticated user. So those are the switches at the end. So that's the table. And so then we'll stay on the table for a second. If I go to my jobs, I've created a job called Apply Temporary Permissions. And this one runs a stored procedure that we'll go through in a few minutes that will apply the temporary permissions that are in the table. So this eliminates the duplicate work of applying the permissions and then adding that information to the table. This way I can just run my job. And it's lightweight, doesn't take much And then I can go back up here. I can show you and post it. Now, if we refresh, Pam from the office is here. And she doesn't have any securables because we gave her Reid, which is a role. So if I go up here, it's showing right there. So those permissions were applied through the job. So in the real world, I have this job running like every 5 minutes. So I could just put the information into the table and then just let it go. Your mileage may vary. That might be too often for you or not enough. You might just do it ad hoc like I do here on my laptop, however you want to do it. So then the next job I run, well, I have this one in the real world set to run every day, once a day, about 8 a.m. early in the morning. But so because I am going to notify people, whoever it was that requested it, that there's a job expiring. I'm sorry, permissions that are expiring. Do they want to extend that, or are they okay with deleting it? So I just ran the job. I'm going to pull up and I'll show you my email that I just got. And here it has permissions will be deleted soon, and it has the table, has the username, server name, database name, expiration date, and the exact permissions that were granted. That gives the person who requested those permissions all the information that they would possibly need to make that decision, so they don't have to go back and look at their ticket or the database. They could just send that back to the DBA team if they needed extended, or they could just ignore it if they are okay with deleting it. So that's the email, and I have it set to run for 5 days before it expires. And people get so much email that sometimes they don't see all the emails right away. And so I kind of like bother them a little bit. And that seems to work out pretty well. I haven't had people complain too much. So, but your mileage may vary. You can change that. Okay, so now I'm just running some T-SQL to quickly update the my table. So if I show you now, Pam from the office is now expired. And I have a calculated field in here to tell you how many hours before it expires. And I have it set by hours because that's how often I run the delete job, which we'll show in a minute. And so that's just how I have it set. So expiration date is now in the past. And so I have another table. So we have the active temp perms table. Then I have an archive temp perms table. And if you see, I can select from there, and there's nothing in there yet. So Pam is still in the temp perms table, but not in the archive. So now I'm going to run my job, and I'm going to run these through the T-SQL because it's faster for the demo. But the delete job, again, in the real world, I have this one set to run once an hour. So it will delete any permissions up through that hour. I originally had it set to run once a day, so you could do that also. But it's lightweight. It doesn't take up a lot. So here we go. I'm going to run our delete and archive job. So now if we go back up to PM from the office, if I refresh, she is still there. And honestly, when I first started it, I had deleted the user also, but there are times when we don't want to delete the user. We use this not just with individuals, but for like groups or even service accounts. And there might be times where they need to have Connect and not have permissions. And so I don't automatically delete that, but you can add that in pretty easily if you felt more risky, more of a risk taker than I am. But if we go to Pam from the office, you can see her permissions are gone. Those were deleted, the job ran, and it expired, so the permissions are deleted. And if I select from the active table, she's no longer in there. And that row is now in the archive table. And I have the archive table so that if I need to see who had permissions at a given time or at some point in the past, I can look that up. It's for documentation. So that is our first example, was Pam from the office with Reid. And then next we're going to do, and I'm going to do the rest of these through T-SQL to make it easier for the demo. But this time we're going to give Pam from the office, insert on the person.person table in AdventureWorks. So, and you'll see up here, I've included in a comment the fields that I don't need to add any information for because they're defaults. I just included that for to make it easier for you to see what I'm doing. So let's go ahead and put that into our table. So now you can see Pam from the office, and this is a securable. So my securable is true, is schema is false. This is insert into the person.person table. I'm also going to add an entry for a securable on a schema. So it's set up a little differently. So here it's just insert into, it's set up a little differently in this block, which is why I'm showing you that. So let's go ahead and add that to our table. And there we go. Now, Pam from the office doesn't have, if I go to here, she doesn't have these yet because we haven't run the job yet. So let's go ahead and look at the job to apply the temporary permissions. And I'll show you how, I'm sorry, not the job, the stored procedure. The job just runs the stored procedure and we'll go through it. So I have it set up to, so that you have the debugging possibility. If you need to see, it'll just script out what it's going to do, but it won't actually apply those permissions. One of the things I absolutely love that I saw at my company when I started working there was these beautiful comment blocks with a procedure test in here with the any parameters that you need. So I really like that and use those all the time. Okay, so in my stored procedure, I have it set up as a transaction because if I am adding 4 rows and it applies, but only applied 2 of them, but not all of them, that would be annoying. So I either want it to work and work great, or if I have a typo, tell me that there's a problem and it won't work, and then I can fix it and it will take care of all of them at that time. So the transaction is very important. So I have it set up. It's just going through, is there any information, or are there any rows in my table where is active is true and is applied is false? And if you remember when I showed you Pam from the office, that is the default when you first put it in. And then it goes through as a cursor. I know as a DBA, cursors are usually a bad word, but in this case, it works really well for this situation. So I'm just looking for the is active true and is applied false. And I have the stored procedure set up with the comments on each section so that you can follow through quite easily. This first section is some error handling that we'll talk about in a later example. The examples I'm using here are SQL authenticated users or logins. So in those, I have to have the login already created. But if the process works great for a Windows or an AD group, if you use RBAC, etc., at your company, or even service accounts, anything that's a Windows authenticated user, even if the login isn't there, because you have a lot of servers that might not be on that server yet at all. If the login's not there, we'll just create that login. If the user isn't here, creates the user from the login. So here's where it creates the login for Windows authenticated, creates the user if it doesn't exist. And then this one is apply server permissions if a role, apply server permissions if it's a securable. And I just use the fields in the temp table to, as variables in constructing using dynamic SQL to construct the statements too. So apply server permissions if it's a secureable, database permissions if it's a role, a database if it's a secureable but not a schema, database permissions if it is a schema, because those have to be constructed slightly differently. And then once it's gone through all of those, it's going to update the switch is applied to true. Yes, it's applied. And back to the next row. So that's how the apply temporary permissions stored procedure is set up. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the job to apply those permissions. And now we can look up here in AdventureWorks. I'm going to refresh, and Pam from the office is now showing up here. And I look and I have select on the schema, and I have, if I go to that person.person table, I have insert on that table right there in AdventureWorks. So it's server level. It doesn't matter what database. The job will work for all of those. The process will work for all of them. So first example, database with roles. Second, database with securables. Now let's look at server level permissions with a role. So if I go down to my logins, I already have created Allison Swims with Gators. That's my daughter. And you can see in here, she does not have any server roles, and she does not have any server level securables beyond Connect. So I'm going to insert into my temporary permissions table information here on Allison Swims with Gators at this time. As a DBA, this just breaks my heart, but I am going to grant her sysadmin, maybe for an hour or two. It is possible. That's actually why I made it by the hour instead of by the day, was if like an infrastructure team needed higher level permissions as doing a deployment, that I could do it for as short a time as possible and I would not forget to delete it. So now you have Pam from the office, and if we go over to my switches, is applied, those are applied, but Allison Swims with Gators is active but not applied. So that is the sysadmin that she has that just breaks my heart. So the next one we'll do is a server level with securables. So just like before, I'm going to insert the data, and I've included the comment on the ones that are defaulted you don't need, but you'll see that the is server permissions for these server ones has to be set to true. So let's go ahead and insert that into our table. And now there should be 4 rows, hopefully, yes. And here you can see there's a role, but we have alter trace. This is the securable server level securable permission that I am giving her. But again, those are not applied yet, the 2 that I just did, server levels. So let's go ahead and apply those. Just going to run that job. Now, if I go to Allison Swims with Gators and look up, you can see server role, sysadmin, and securable, alter trace. Okay, I wanted to show how it doesn't just delete everything, it only deletes what has expired. So we're going to update the date of expiration for that sysadmin. And you can see in the table that it is, it's still applied, but it is expired. So the negative, hours to expiration is negative. So before we run that job, I thought I would go through the other stored procedures. pretty quickly. Everything is available on my GitHub, and I have that link on the contact slide at the end. So let's go through the notify store procedure. This one is just taking that one requested by email field, and it's going to send an email to that person. So about that row. So they don't see everything in the table. They just see that and for them. I have it set to 5 days. This is where you would change it if you don't want to annoy your people as freely as I do. So then it's set through to go through profile and again a date. So I'm just looking for the if exists select from the temp table that I've just created on the 5 days. Here's the HTML to make that email look decent and easy to read. The fewer words, but the pertinent information, I find the better, so I have it in a table. And then I have, you can see here, I have the recipients goes to that current requester. When troubleshooting, I have it sent to myself, and I can assure you that this is important because I have found this out the hard way. You don't want to accidentally be sending a lot of emails to somebody. So I left that in there to make it super easy to uncomment that and comment this one out, and so that you would put your own email address. Please don't send me all your stuff, but if you do, okay. So that's the notify store procedure. And then after we notify, we're going to run I have the job to delete and archive set up for 2 steps. Those are separate store procedures. So the delete store procedure is very similar to the apply one, only the reverse. So again, has the debug transaction. It's just looking for is active is true, is applied is true, and expiration date and time is before this particular second. So here's some error handling that we'll talk about in a minute. And then delete server permissions if it's a role, just pretty much the opposite of the previous store procedure. Delete server permissions if secureable on server. Delete database permissions if it's role, database permissions if it's a secureable but not a schema, database permissions if it is a schema. And then after it runs through all those, it updates the is active to false. So that one has been true since we put it in, and it is now false. So that's what the delete does. And then the last store procedure is to archive it. And archiving it is just exactly like it sounds. It's copying the information from the temp perms table to the archive table and then deleting that row from the temp table. So it's just inserting into the archive table the information where is active is false. It's the only thing it's doing. Deleting, and then it goes through and deletes them where it's false. Okay, so now let's run the job to delete and archive those temporary permissions. So if you look at the archive before we run the job, we have the one from earlier, but that's all. So now we should have 2 in this one because we don't want Allison to have sysadmin anymore. Allison swims with gators, no longer has sysadmin. And if we go to the active temp perms table, Allison swims with gators with sysadmin is not there, but ultratrace is still there. So if we go over here to Allison swims with gators, server role, sysadmin's gone. But she still has ultratrace. So that is, and then again, I run that delete archive every hour, but originally we ran it every once a day. So it depends. I do not recommend running that manually ad hoc, just because you don't want to have to think about it. So I have a couple examples of error handling that I've added while going through the process. This first one is if there's not a login created for SQL Authenticated. And again, like I said, Windows Authenticated doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's not on that server, but a SQL Authenticated one does. You have to set it up with your password, etc. And that is beyond the scope of this process. So let's do an example here. I'm going to add into my temp perms table. This one is for Thunder Falcon to have insert into the person table. So if now we're going to try, we're just going to execute that stored procedure to apply it, and then we get the error that SQL login needs to be created manually. So if I go into the table, Thunder Falcon is there, but it cannot apply the jobs. It'll work at you. So let's go ahead and clean that up so we can go ahead and do the last error handling one without it breaking. So I just deleted that row. Sorry, Thunder Falcon. The last one, and this one is one that we've had to add. If there's a reason, like you might give a temporary permissions for maybe a month or two, and for some reason that user is deleted from the database. Maybe they left the company, maybe they changed teams, something like that. And so this is an example of how that still works. Originally, that doesn't work. It would just give an error saying that that user was not in the database. Sorry, can't do it. And so let's insert Katie archives medieval history into our temporary permissions table. So this one, we are giving her post-it replacement. We're giving her right in post-it replacement. So I run the job to apply those permissions. So now if we go up to post-it replacement, I refresh. I'm going to see Katie archives medieval history. She has the permissions. She has right in prod. Not liking that. But let's say she left the company. Please don't leave the company, Katie. And left the company. So somebody, for whatever reason, she is no longer a user in that database. However, she's still in the table. So let's just set so it's expiring. In our temp perms table, she's still there, but she's not in the database. And if I run that job, it still works because I have in the delete job at the top, and this is where I told you I would come back to it. I have a section here that checks for if there's a missing user and just marks it as active as false and then move on. So that troubleshooting, that's some error handling. There's more error handling I would probably add, but we just don't have the errors happen that often. Those edge cases happen that often, and I haven't gone back to do that. But those are the error handling situations that we've had often enough to update the process. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. I have my contact information here, my email, the GitHub with all of the Sprox and the demo script are there. I'm EduDiva on Twitter and on Mastodon, and my LinkedIn, and I am ready for questions. Do we have any questions?
None in the chat, Sharon.
Okay.
But if anybody does have questions that they maybe thought of, they can post them now. I thought, though, the content was excellent. I've already been digging into the GitHub. So, yeah, this is definitely something that I'm going to be looking at to see what can be used elsewhere. It certainly makes sense to me.
Thank you. Surely people have questions. So I just really wanted to emphasize that if I was going to ask people to use those temporary permissions frequently, then reducing the work for the DBAs to do that made a lot of sense and seems to work pretty well. Favorite feature of the process. My favorite feature of the process is the fact that I don't have to go back and delete those permissions later, that it just happens. It just happens because I didn't always remember. And then, you know, permissions would grow. More error handling would be what I would add. Some of the, yeah. Some of those edge cases where we have an error that may only happen a couple times a year, so it hasn't been enough for me to go back in and add that. But at some point, oh, I know what my next thing to add to the process is, not just an end time, but a start time, so that I could have that start at some point in the future. That is the next thing I want to add to the process. That's for those Saturday deployments. If somebody needs elevated permissions for a few hours on a Saturday, I don't want to have to do that on Saturday morning.